Let's talk about agriculture, which is, of course, one of the big stories in Nigeria. Food inflation well above 35%. Experts in the agricultural space are suggesting that perhaps the Nigerian government should control the input prices for items that are vital to producing food in the country. Will that bring things down? We have another great guest with us to talk about it. Victoria Madedor. She is the Group Head Business Development at the Bank of Industry. That's the BOI Investment and Trust Company. Thank you so much for joining us. Good morning to you. And, you know, happy International Women's Day, Women's Month and everything. So I guess I have a how and a should question. How would the government control input prices for agri products or food?
Okay, so speaking from my own perspective and in my own capacity, I'd say that it shouldn't be controlled. Because the pros and cons of this conversation, and there's nothing in terms of policy that will suit, that is one size fits all, and will suit every individual in the country or every entrepreneur in the country. However, a level playing field will allow for more foreign direct investment into the country, because everybody will know that you buy for A and you sell for B, and you can put whatever markup that works for you, regardless of how much you buy. Yes, we're looking at the cost implication for those at the bottom of the pyramid. Also, not regulating will allow more people at the bottom of the pyramid to look inward, to also say, let us go back to the field, and then fight for survival, because right now we're at the point where we need to survive. And you do not control how people survive. You allow them to identify how and where they choose to work around this.
Well said. You sound like a capitalist, which is well, let the markets determine this price. But there's an emergency that has been declared. I think it was July of last year, and at that time, food inflation was at 26.9%, if I remember correctly. Now it's over 35%. So I guess what can we do to address what's happening now with these higher food prices and, you know, lower supply and so on? Well, what do you think can be done? So
I would say that first, access to credit should be a priority, because most of these inflation, as in quote, is because most of those people, entrepreneurs, do not have access to credit. So if I have access to a low interest credit, my markup also will be reflected, my pricing will be reflected based on how much I source my funding. That is one. Secondly, we need to have a cluster kind of structure where it is easy for people to come together and buy things and have a negotiating power and buy things at a lower rate. Because the more you buy, the more flexible your pricing becomes. Because you can actually control the narrative at that point, because you're the one determining the market. You are the force in itself. So yes, there is an emergency. We need to nib it at the board. But the major thing we need to look at is security. If farmers are able to go back to the farms and till the soil, and then have some level of mechanization, we're not looking at the most flamboyant kind of mechanization. We're talking about even at the most simple kind of mechanization. Do the land clearing, plow the lands for them, let them have access to even rent these things. I'm telling you, we will be back on track.
I am glad you mentioned mechanization, because if I were just looking at our trade numbers in the last segment, where as far as imports, the largest sector or the largest category for imports in 2023 for Nigeria was machinery and transport equipment. So we are spending, I think we spent 12 trillion, I think was the number we spent last year. If we need mechanized farming to scale, what about the cost of the machines, the education level of the farmers? Most of them are subsistence farmers. Is mechanization something that can work here in Nigeria? Can we afford it? Because we're spending so much money on these machines.
I'll tell you, I have gone to the very rural of the very rural.
Yeah.
Narrative is what really affects most of us in this country.
Okay.
We believe that these farmers are not knowledgeable. We always carry this assumption that they do not know how to use technology. They might not speak English, but trust me, they are versatile when it comes to using some of these technologies. Because there are some non-governmental organizations that have taken upon themselves to ensure that these rural farmers are informed about the latest type of seeds that we have, improved seeds. They're talking about using drones for broadcasting of seeds rather than just spraying them, and we have a lot of losses. These rural farmers are becoming more aware by the day. Some of this mechanized equipment may not get to these rural farmers because of our roads.
Okay, good point. Good point.
Right? Yeah. Infrastructure is one of the things that is plaguing the sector. If we have good roads, we're not talking about, it doesn't have to be tarred, right? Let it just be motorable, grade the roads, and let these farmers have access to these roads and bring their products out. I tell you, you will be amazed what we can do as a country. But please don't underestimate.
Hey, I stand corrected.
The rural farmers.
You are in the space, so you are the expert. You'll be able to tell us better there. So fantastic. That is good to know. What do you make of the call for customs to freeze the exchange rate used for importing food into the country as a way to try to augment prices, or should the exchange rate be allowed to do what it does? What do you think of that?
It's a very tricky position to be at, because you look at the pros. It's floating it seems to be good, but however, when it comes to food, I'll tell you the truth. We need to be able to control it. Yeah, because what we import determines to a large extent, when it comes to input, what we can produce and how expensive it will be to produce these things. However, looking inward, we need to start working with the likes of our research institutes, both locally funded and funded by multilateral and bilateral organizations. And we need to start putting money on the table for these researches that postgraduate students, undergraduate students, research students work with locally, because we have improved varieties that it's too expensive for them to do extension services. So if we're able to manage those costs, then we'll say, yeah, please float it. But we cannot, as it were today. We cannot, we are not self-sufficient when it comes to food. We do not produce most of the fertilizers that we use, pesticides that we use. But I'll tell you one interesting thing. Now that we are having this crisis, a lot of those rural farmers will say, oh, Victoria, do you know what? We're beginning to use our local what we used to be called outdated technology, and fermenting the droppings of goats and cows, to sprinkle our vegetables, so that we don't have to use chemical-based pesticide, because they are imported into the country. But in totality, I'll tell you, we need to look at it from the point of how expensive it will be to the rural farmer to accept those things, to afford those inputs. Okay,
on the matter of looking inward, we always say looking inward, how much does power play a role here in terms of food that gets that's perishable and spoils, and the wastage? Is power the silver bullet here? Is that, as far as storing food, and even to be able to produce most of these things that we want to produce here at home, is there no link there? How much have you had to talk about electricity supply and power when dealing with players in the agricultural space? Okay, so I worked with some Entities.
educational institutions
Okay.
to look at post-harvest management, right? And I'll tell you gladly that today there are some businesses that are beginning to produce powdered tomatoes.
Whoa.
Oh yes.
Okay.
So the rate at which we have spoilage in tomatoes is beginning to reduce because they are converting what is in excess into powder.
Yeah.
And not only using it locally, they're also exporting that powdered tomato out of the country. So these are some of the things that, yes, it bites really hard, right? But you have to be in a position where you're not comfortable for you to innovate, for you to invent yourself. So power, yes, it's something we struggle with in the agricultural space, but I'll tell you, it is not it's not the worst of it.
Yeah.
The worst of it is having poor farm inputs. That's it, and not being able to process whatever you produce.
Fair enough, fair enough. So, I mean, a lot of what you've talked about has been innovation. You've talked a lot about players in the sector, the farmers who are going to animal dung for fertilizers, the other ones using, powder for tomatoes and so on. But, I mean, there's some support has to come from the government side, right? I mean, in addition to all this innovation that we're seeing, to some extent, it's two sides. Mm-hmm. Yeah?
Yes. Government support. People have complained about the implementations of government support.
Yeah.
You've had the feedback on the anchor borrowers, you've had and all of that. But the truth is, in everything we do, government have always supported the agricultural space.
Yeah.
With fertilizers, with inputs and all of that. We are not, in my conversation, I'm not eliminating the fact that we don't need government support, but I'm saying that we should not depend fully on government support.
Yeah.
We need to begin to take our initiative and lead the conversation. If you look at the agricultural sector in Costa Rica, it is really not dependent on the government. It's a small country that intentionally and decided that we are going to make ourselves food sufficient, and it has to be driven by the private sector. The government is an enabler. They should provide security, infrastructure, and other enabling factors. But innovations, sustainability must come from the entrepreneurs and innovators in the sector.
Well said. What's your outlook for food prices this year? Do you think things could moderate? What's it dependent on? Are you optimistic because we're still very early in the year? It's only March. How do you think? I hope I don't call you back when food inflation is at 50%.
I hope we don't get there.
Yeah, so how do you see things playing out this year?
I think it might get worse because
you're very honest.
Yes, it might get worse because it's farming. It's seasons. Right. You have to plant to harvest. How much did we really plant in 2023? So the harvest is going to reflect in the pricing. Security also was one of the factors that made most of the farmers leave the rural area to begin to do motorbike riding in the cities. Right. So it is what it is, but what we need to do is begin to intentionally drive the narrative into safety for farmers. You can go back to the farm. You can farm and harvest without someone coming to ask you to pay taxes for you to take out your produce. So the worst is yet to come, but we're hoping that more farmers will go back to the fields, and we're hoping that even the impact of climate change, to be honest.
I thank you for bringing that up. I was going to touch on that. Thank you.
The impact of climate change is affecting the farmers. So more needs to be done. I would really encourage most of these non-governmental organizations, mostly the international ones, to help the farmers to look at ways to bring the burden of climate change to a bearable level.
Thank you so much. I think we're almost out of time, but I have to have you speak on International Women's Day and Women's Month. Basically, its significance. Do we have enough women in your field, in agriculture, looking at how to, improve investment and so on in that field?
We have amazing women.
We do?
Honestly, we have champions, we have warriors in that space. We have women who have broken barriers in the agricultural sector, that have innovated things that are mind-blowing, both locally and internationally. But most of them are not at the front.
Right.
They are not media savvy.
Yeah.
So to my fellow women, I need you to come out and tell your story.
There you go.
Your story will definitely forge a better future for the younger generation.
Well said. Well said. Victoria Madedor, the Group Head, Business Development, Bank of Industry, Investment and Trust Company. Thank you so much for giving us your very, very excellent insights on boosting agricultural output in Nigeria. Thank you so much.